For more on all of this, I'm now joined by data security expert Jamal Ahmed. Jamal, afternoon.
Good afternoon, Bill.
Of course, there are critics on this, but what is wrong with trying to stop voter fraud?
There's nothing wrong with trying to stop voter fraud. However, there is something wrong with imposing restrictions on individuals and preventing them from voting. Now, I've spoken about this with some of my counterparts in the US, and there's US civil rights group there calling a Republican-style voter suppression. Now, the reason this is such a concern, Bill, is because what the government is saying is, hey, we've got a problem here, and the problem is one person in 2017 was prosecuted in the recent history of impersonation. So this is actually a non-problem they're trying to solve by pretending they're trying to do something to legitimize the democratic process. In fact, all they're really trying to do is to reduce anyone that votes against them. And the reason they're doing that is because what they're trying to say is you need to have photo ID to turn up. And there's nothing wrong with that. Now, the problem is when you say you need photo ID that is a representation of you now, a lot of people have ID that doesn't necessarily look like them. For example, if you take someone who's a transgender person, the national ID that they have is not going to be an accurate representation of them. And when we had the pilot done earlier this year, when some people were tested to ask for voting, we saw droves of people turned away, and those people didn't come back, which means they gave up their right to vote rather than go back a second time and be put out.
The cost isn't the problem, is it, though, Jamal? Because the government says you can just get a free card. It'll cost nothing.
Well, the government does say you can get a free card, it doesn't cost nothing, but the Electoral Commission actually did some research, and what they said is, if the government said you need a driving license and a passport as the acceptable photo ID that's a representation of you, they would automatically exclude around 24% of the electorate. And the challenge is when you exclude 24% of the electorate, the kind of people you're likely to turn away, based on the research done by the Electoral Commission, is people that are older, that are disabled, the homeless voters, and also the younger black and ethnic minority people. And these people are less likely to be right-wing, and they're far more likely to be further along the political spectrum, meaning they're less likely to be conservative voters.
But what if they can get a card, then what's stopping them from voting, if it's that easy to obtain that ID?
People have a free choice, Bill. Everyone has the right to vote, and imposing all of these restrictions is further infringing on the civil liberties that we've grown to enjoy in this country. A lot of people went through a lot of trouble, and a lot of blood, sweat and tears were lost for everyone to have the right to vote. Now the Conservative Party, Boris Johnson, who in his own words said he would rather eat an ID card rather than present it to someone to confirm his identity, is trying to introduce something that he was completely against, and something that we see backbenchers in his party are totally against as well. It's totally unfair, and all it's going to do is drive people away from the voting booths, and it means it increases the likelihood of people who are allowed to vote for the Tories to keep them in power for longer.
But are there data security implications, though? I mean, a lot of people obviously are whipping this up as saying this is an invasion of privacy. A lot of people don't mind their passports or driving licenses, of course, being issued and being looked at. But are people concerned about perhaps what happens to the data on these ID cards?
Yes, and this is the other concern. So what they're saying is there's about 3.5 million people at the moment who might not have photo ID, and therefore local councils can actually provide them to them free of charge. But what people are concerned about is that is becoming a centralized database. It's another way of infringing on people's civil liberties. It's another way of introducing surveillance. And in the own words of members of the Conservative parties, it's ID cards by the back door, which is totally unacceptable. Previous governments have tried to introduce it, and the public has always been in uproar about it. And what we see here is it trying to come sneaking under the radar, pretending to solve a problem that doesn't exist.
Jamal, good to talk to you on this. Thank you very much indeed for your input this afternoon live on RTK. Jamal Ahmed.